Yes, Ms Islam.
Good afternoon. Mr Chairman, members of the panel, we are now going to read extracts from a number of statements provided by the bereaved, survivors and residents relating to their experiences in the immediate aftermath of the fire. We will be taking a thematic approach to the evidence and will be addressing the following 8 sections. Section 1, rest centres set up in the immediate aftermath of the fire. Section 2, emergency accommodation. Section 3, financial assistance. Section 4, psychosocial support. Section 5, information for those looking for the missing. Section 6, public communication. Section 7, observations on the response. And Section 8, impact. Dealing with this important evidence in this way is designed to provide illustrative examples of the experiences of those directly affected in the immediate aftermath. This includes the experiences of the bereaved, tower residents, tower survivors, and also evacuated residents. I wish to emphasise that we recognise the experiences of those affected are not homogenous. The lived experience of every affected person is individual and distinct. Seeking to draw out selected extracts is not at all intended to take away from this, and every statement is important in its entirety. The inquiry has received in the region of 215 Phase 2 statements relevant to Module 4. Whilst we will not be reading from every statement, this does not take away from the significance of every individual's contribution to the inquiry. Every statement has been reviewed by the inquiry team and has shaped our work in Module 4 and will form part of the inquiry record. Many of these statements have already been published on the inquiry website as they were pertinent to issues under consideration for Module 3. Some of the statements dealt solely with aftermath and they are yet to be published, and we will endeavour to publish these in the ensuing days. This document has been drafted as a thematic summary, and as such, I do not propose to take the panel to each and every statement as I read through the document. I will do my best when reading through the document to pronounce names as best as I can, and I apologise in advance for any that I do not get right. Before we begin, I need to give a trigger warning. Some may find hearing about their experiences and the experiences of others in the immediate aftermath distressing. If anybody wishes to leave the room or stop the live stream, please do so now. Turning to the first section, then please, dealing with the initial hours and the rest centres that were set up in the immediate aftermath. On the night of the fire, survivors, tower residents and evacuated residents from nearby properties report not knowing where to go or what to do. Many people with loved ones who lived in the tower arrived at the scene to try and find information. Jenny Dainton lived in flat 12 on the 4th floor with her 2 daughters. She was at the scene on the morning of 14th of June and said, "There were lots of people searching for their loved ones who were missing. Everyone was trying to understand what had happened. We were in a state of shock and disbelief. I saw people with no shoes, men sobbing, and people collapsed on the floor. No one at that time had any answers. No one was there to tell us what we should do or where we should go. Immediately after the fire, the only support I received was from my sister and mum. Initially, I was not aware of any support being provided in the local area. However, the local community started pulling together during the 14th of June. Through word of mouth, I also became aware that the Rugby Portobello Club had opened its doors and was offering support to those affected. Marcia Levi was evacuated from Testerton Walk at around 1:30 a.m. and said, "We did not know where to go or what to do. No one told us where to go. I did not see anyone from RBKC. There was no direction. There was no one of authority. It was understandably disorganised, but it went on for far too long, with us not knowing what to do and being told that you could not go back to your flats. We were left outside for hours without being updated of what to do or where to go, and there didn't appear to be anyone around to ask or offer guidance. We were outside until around 9 a.m. We were petrified. We thought the tower was going to fall down. William Thompson lived in flat 52 of the tower with his partner and their 2 daughters. He says that, "We were told that buses would be coming to transport us somewhere, but weren't told where. We remained here waiting for the buses. One bus turned up and moved off after 5 minutes. We remained on Clarendon Road for another 2 hours waiting for transport. Nobody was telling us anything and we did not know what to do. After another 3 hours, someone came and told us that if we went to the rugby club, there would be tea and refreshments there and they would supply us with clothing. We decided to walk to the rugby club. We arrived at around 4:30 a.m. and we were given blankets and refreshments." A number of spontaneous rest centres were set up by the community and faith leaders in the early hours of the morning of 14th of June 2017. These provided shelter and support to those directly affected. These rest centres include, but are not limited to, the Rugby Portobello Club, the Clement James Centre and St Clement's Church, Almanar Mosque, Notting Hill Methodist Church, Latimer Community Church and the Harrow Club. Elizabeth Sabiashuk lived in flat 43 on the 7th floor of the tower with her husband Michael and their daughter Florentina. She says, "We waited there amongst the chaos for what seemed an incredibly long time, and then a policeman told us that the Rugby Portobello Club had been opened. We were some of the first people to arrive at the Rugby Portobello Club. When we went in, they gave us blankets and hot drinks, and the 3 of us just sat there, huddled together, waiting to be told what we should do next. The atmosphere became increasingly oppressive and harrowing, as so many people were traumatised and grieving and looking for missing relatives or friends who had been in the tower. Those who were trying to find people were desperate because they were going between various sites, and there was no way of them knowing where they would find their loved ones at that time, or if they would at all." Michael Chiappetto lived in flat 155 on the 18th floor with his partner Berkti Hafdom and her son Biruk, both of whom perished in the fire. He says, "Immediately after the fire, information about what to do or what was happening was not clear, and it seemed the council and the TMO had vanished. I went to the Rugby Portobello Club and for the first time found somewhere that was actually trying to help the tower residents. They were trying to help the people who lived in the tower as well as the bereaved. I knew Rugby Portobello because I went there with Biruk for the homework club. It meant that I knew it and I was comfortable going there. They focused on people from the Grenfell Tower. It created a space where we could be without lots of people. It was somewhere that understood what was going on and who wanted to help." Abraham Abebe lived in flat 44 on the 7th floor of the tower with his wife Turafat Yilma Girma and their son. He says, "We had very good support at the Rugby Portobello Trust. In the hours after the fire, the Portobello Rugby Trust became an informal information exchange for the residents of the tower. It was where we went to find out about people or to inform others that people were missing. In the days following the fire, the staff of RBKC and the TMO were conspicuous by their total absence." Jevon Moses, a Grenfell Walk resident, says, "On the night of the fire, Grenfell Tower residents went to the Rugby Portobello Club and Grenfell Walk residents went to the Clement's Church. Someone at Rugby Portobello Club themselves confirmed that they were only helping Grenfell Tower residents as they turned me away. After a few weeks, Rugby Club opened their services to residents who were not living in the tower." Hazel Burke, a resident from Barrendon Walk, describes being outside on the street until 4 a.m. when St Clement's Church opened. She states, "I did not know where else we could have gone apart from the church at this time. Volunteers started bringing donations to the church in the morning. It was like a flea market. There was so much food, clothing and toiletries, all in donations. People turned up from everywhere to try to help. St Clement's was open and busy for the rest of the week. Donations kept arriving and people came continually to collect things that they needed. I know that the Rugby Club, Harrow Club and Methodist Church also opened and offered assistance. St Clement's Church and other churches, mosques and local community groups played a vital role in supporting the community at that time. Ibtisam Al-Fawaz, who lived in Hurstway Walk, says, "On the second day, a lot of people from the walkways and families who did not have anywhere to go slept at the Clement James Centre. I rejected any food and drink that was provided in the initial relief centres in Westway and Clement James Centre, as I felt like this was meant for people who lost their clothes and belongings. I understood that this was also available to me, but I felt like it was not my right to take it." Simon Jolly, a resident of Barrendon Walk, says that St Clement's had an open door policy and was a huge source of help to the community more widely. The Latimer Christian Centre was set up in the early hours of 14th of June and was open to all. Shaheen Saddafi lived in flat 22 on the 5th floor of the tower with his mother. Speaking about his arrival at the scene, he says, "There was absolute chaos and confusion everywhere. There were tons of people still in the area, looking for loved ones and having faces of shock and loss. We had no information about what to do. We noticed that people were going into Latimer Christian Centre. We went inside and saw it was a relief centre. There were piles of bags of clothes and donations already there. People were making tea. It was full of people in the community. People seemed to sense we were tower residents and began surrounding us and asking us if we were okay and hugging us. We sat in shock at their kindness." Joseph Kyle John lived in flat 6 on the 2nd floor of the tower with his former partner, Leanne Meyer Jackson LeBlanc, and their son. He says, "After escaping the fire, we went to Latimer Church and stayed there. It was mainly the church and the local community that were helping survivors immediately after the fire. I stayed at Latimer Church for a few days after the fire. If it was not for the church, I was walking the streets. I slept at night on the floor of the church." Survivors and residents also attended other community rest centres that had been set up. Nina Masro was evacuated from Testerton Walk and said that at around 7 or 8 a.m. she went to the Harrow Club. She says, "The Red Cross were there. I think they had just arrived when we got there, as they hadn't set up an area yet. They were handing out forms for people to fill in their information. The club was packed with people. I remember seeing Jessica Abano's family there. They were looking for Jessica. I remember hugging her mum and dad. I spoke to another woman there who had recently lost a baby, and she was still bleeding. I went around the place looking for sanitary towels. I was trying to help the best that I could, but I was also in shock." Turning now to the Westway Centre, which initially opened as a spontaneous rest centre and later became the official rest centre. Survivors describe confusion at the Westway Centre, issues with gaining entry, being unsure of what support was available, and the absence of a visible presence from RBKC and the TMO. Omar Al-Hajj Ali lived in flat 112 on the 14th floor with his brother Muhammad Al-Hajj Ali and his friend Mahmoud Al-Karad. His brother Muhammad perished in the fire. After being discharged from hospital on 15th of June, he was taken to the Westway Centre. He says, "I did not know what I was meant to be doing. I just kept asking myself why I was there and what was happening. I had a lot of fears, like whether I will be homeless now and what will happen next. No one came up to talk to me about what help I needed. That was what I needed. No one knew anything about me, like whether I'd been in the tower or not. I didn't see anyone from the council, any doctors or hospital staff, or any officials at the Westway. There were no information desks. It was just lots of people who looked like they were volunteers or from the community, but who weren't able to give me any advice about what I should be doing. It was emotionally difficult to be with so many people." Manuel Miguel Ferreira Alves lived in flat 105 on the 13th floor of the tower with his wife and his children. Initially, they stayed with friends, and on the 16th of June, they went to Westway. When we went to the Westway, there was simply confusion everywhere. There were lots of people around, but I do not remember anyone making it clear that they were from the council. Nadia El-Bouti, a resident from Hurstway Walk, says, "We had to spend a lot of time looking around the Westway before we found someone official. I'm not sure if they were from RBKC or another council." Jason Miller lived in flat 145 on the 17th floor with his partner Corinne Simone Jones and their 2 children. He says, "RBKC had a desk at the Westway Centre, but they did not offer anything beyond getting temporary or emergency accommodation. Their role was really marginal, and they could not offer anything to help us at that time. The staff there seemed as powerless as us." Simon Jolly describes going to the Westway Centre. He says, "It seemed really chaotic, as there had been a huge influx of donations on the Friday and Saturday, but there was no apparent structure to process and store it. We were concerned that there were not even basic things like signs or notices, so that people could know where to go for what. It was a free-for-all for anyone who turned up, whilst survivors were being discharged from hospital with nothing. It was clearly problematic that people were required to show up, to make themselves and their needs known in order to receive support, as this automatically meant that those who were most injured, traumatised or isolated were left at a disadvantage when they should have been the priority." However, he goes on to say that once Ealing Council had been brought in, by the Sunday afternoon, the centre was completely different. Systems were in place, and there was a real sense of community and various services working together. A registration system was introduced at the Westway Centre, where people were asked to provide identification before entering. Sahib Hirsi lived in flat 7 on the 3rd floor of the tower with his father and brother. He states, "My experience at the Westway was terrible. When I arrived, I was asked for identification at the door. I explained that I did not have any identification, given everything I owned was still in our flat in the tower. They continued to ask me for some sort of identification. I had to wait until the person at the door was not looking and sneak into the centre. It was absolutely ridiculous that I had to sneak into the place that was supposed to be offering me support." William Thompson says, "I remember joining a queue to speak to a woman at the desk. I think from the NHS or a social worker, but I'm not sure. The person in front of me had escaped the tower with nothing at all, except what he was wearing, and the person at the desk asked him for identification, like a passport or a driving licence, and insisting one needed to be produced before any help would be given. I made clear I had known him for years and that he was a Grenfell Tower resident, but it was pointless, as I was also asked for identification documents, and I did not have any to show I was from the tower. As part of the verification process, survivors were given wristbands upon entry. Jose Vieiro, who lived in flat 46 on the 7th floor of the tower with his wife and daughter, says, "I remember the British Red Cross being in the Westway. I did not like what they were doing. They marked us like we were going into a concentration camp. They gave you a wristband which was coloured differently every day. And every day you had to register to get into the Westway Centre. You were marked and easily identifiable when you walked down the street." Similarly, Zoe Dainton, who lived in flat 12 of the tower, says it also meant that journalists in the area could easily identify you. Jenny Dainton says, speaking about the Westway Centre, "I found it was more formal and bureaucratic compared to the rugby club. I believe it had been set up by RBKC. You had to wear wristbands to get through security. There were lots of different organisations here, including the DVLA, Home Office and RBKC. They all sat behind tables, which I felt created a barrier between them and me. I found the Westway to be impersonal. As a result, some people used the Westway Centre less. Turafat Yilma Girma lived in flat 44. She says, "We used the Westway Centre less. It was not as easily accessible because the Red Cross made it difficult to get in at all. You were asked so many questions just to be able to get in that it became unpleasant for me and my family. The problems with getting access at all was so bad. Additionally, it felt like a shelter for government representatives and the council staff, rather than a refuge and support centre. It felt as though rather than coming to us for support, we had to go to them. Other witnesses also share negative experiences of the British Red Cross. Zohra Al-Assad, a Grenfell Walk resident, says, "We were given forms to complete by the Red Cross. My son and I completed the forms and we were not given anything. We also submitted our passports and at the end, we got nothing. Later we were told that only the people that were admitted to hospital would benefit from the Red Cross relief." Contrastingly, others share positive observations of the British Red Cross. Hamza Jones lost his brother-in-law, Abdul Aziz Al-Wahabi, his wife, Fawzia Al-Wahabi, and their 3 children, Yasin, Nurhuda, and Mehdi, who lived in flat 182 on the 21st floor of the tower. He says, "The Red Cross, with limited funding, did an excellent job. When they first came, there was no one telling anyone what to do. They started to organise things, where the people needed help, how they could get food and clothing, and in the background there was someone organising for people to go. They were like a light." Sandra Ruiz, bereaved aunt of Jessica Urbano Ramirez, says, "The Red Cross were friendly and welcoming, but they seemed out of their depth in terms of organisation. The lines were really long, and it was too hot in the room to be waiting ages there. They were meant to be helping coordinate information and donations and food and drink." Evacuated residents from the walkways also had issues with gaining access to the Westway Centre. Jevon Moses of Grenfell Walk says, "I went to Westway on the night of the fire and they were just horrible. They were not letting anyone from Grenfell Walk in, with lots of the staff standing outside saying nothing. After the fire, I did not know where to go." Ahmed Musaid lived in Grenfell Walk and was initially not allowed in. "I gave my name and address to the Red Cross and they didn't let me in as they couldn't find my name and there was no organisation of what was happening. I was left waiting outside. There was security there and people weren't allowed in. When he was later allowed in, he said, 'As a relief centre at first, I thought Westway was chaos. You couldn't speak to anyone, everyone would tell me a different story. Nobody was clear what was going to happen when I was going back to my flat.' Jessica Gomez, a Grenfell Walk resident, says, "When we first went to the Westway, they refused to help us because we were not from the tower, and they did not know that we had been evacuated and in fact had lost our homes. We had to fight for everything we got. We had to go to the Westway to register with the Red Cross. They were kind and tried to be helpful, but they did not really know who we, as Grenfell Walk residents, were, and said they would need to check and come back the next day." Some Walkway residents say they were also issued with wristbands. Caesar Renito, who lived in Testerton Walk with his wife, Isabel Renito, says that on the 15th of June, someone from the council was at the Westway with a register of Walkway residents, which they marked people off the list and gave them wristbands. Giuseppe Raza, who lived in Barrendon Walk, said when queuing to get into Westway, "As far as I can recall, there was no method of prioritisation, and I queued with Tower residents and Walkway residents alike." Some survivors slept at the Westway Centre. Branislav Lukic, who lived at flat 84 on the 11th floor of the tower, says, "I felt really lost and did not know what to do. No one around the tower told me where I could go to sleep or what I should do to get help. The next day, I wanted to get back to the tower to see what was going on. I was directed to the Westway Centre. The Westway had been set up as a centre for survivors. There were what seemed like hundreds of mattresses on the floor of the centre for people to sleep. I can't remember how long I slept there for. I think it was 2 nights. I do remember that it felt very strange there. There were about 20 of us amongst all of the empty mattresses. It was a very sad place to be. It really felt like it was somewhere for people that did not have anywhere better to go." The Jafari family from flat 86 on the 11th floor stayed in the Westway Centre for 10 days and were the last to leave. Maria Jafari describes her experiences of staying at the Westway Centre and says, Staying and sleeping in the Westway was horrific. As a Muslim woman, modesty is important, and when sleeping, I did not want to expose parts of my body. I found this very stressful. For 2 days after the fire, I stayed in the same clothes I was wearing on leaving the tower. No one offered us a change of new clean clothes. All day there were people coming in and out. It was very public. Rashida Ali, who lived in flat 125 on the 15th floor of the tower with her husband and daughter, says, "I didn't know that people were staying in Westway overnight on the night of the fire. When we took Sid, her husband, to the hospital, we missed that. If I knew that I would have stayed there. This also would have meant that I would have had earlier access to the clothing and other donated items that I needed." Turning now to Section 2 on emergency accommodation. A number of issues were experienced, including a lack of information about where to go, uncertainty about the length of stay in hotels, unsuitable room arrangements, issues with the provision of food, distance of hotels from the community, and specific needs not being met. Sapide Mine Moghadam lived in flat 4 on the first floor of the tower with her son. She states, "I escaped from the tower with my son and sat at the grass verge outside the tower. I then went to my car and drove to the end of the road, where I was blocked in by fire engines, so I just parked there. My son and I slept in the car that night until approximately 9 a.m. Maher Kuder lived in flat 64 on the 9th floor. Flat 64 on the 9th floor with his wife and 3 daughters. They went to the rugby club after escaping the tower, and he says, "My daughter was pregnant. She slept under the table because there were no mattresses around." Abdul Wahab Abdul Hamid lived in flat 14 on the first floor of the tower with his wife, her brother, and her friend. Amina Yusuf Muhammad. After escaping the tower, he and his wife were taken to hospital, where he says, "My wife called RBKC to inquire about what we should do, as my wife was heavily pregnant and we did not know where to go. We were looking for information. RBKC told us to wait there and wait for a call back for further instructions. After waiting for a few hours, we had not received a call back. We decided to go directly to the town hall, but when we arrived, we were again told to wait until someone came out to see us. We were eventually told that no one was available and we would have to come back the next day. As we stood outside, a security guard who could see our distress agreed to find someone to help us. After waiting outside for approximately 30 minutes, a woman came out, gave us Oyster cards and told us to make our way to the Premier Inn Hotel. She did not explain anything to us. The lady just handed us the Oyster cards and told us to go there. We took a taxi to the hotel. A friend of mine gave money to take the taxi. Alison Moses lived in flat 11 on the 4th floor of the tower. She describes having mobility issues, which RBKC and the TMO were aware of. She says that in the early hours of 14th of June, someone called me about emergency accommodation. I don't know who they were. A woman's voice said she had a room for me at a hotel in Earl's Court. She did not give me any details or any choice. After the person hung up, I realised I had a room reserved, but no way to get there, no money, no clothes. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I was in my dressing gown. Chirag Patel's parents lived in flat 56 on the 8th floor of the tower. He describes how his parents went to stay with his uncle for 2 weeks. He says no one from RBKC or the TMO had reached out to any of us during this time. Accommodation was arranged for his parents about 2 weeks after the fire. Some survivors had issues with finding their hotels and experienced problems upon arrival. Janare Batoon lived in flat 146 on the 17th floor of the tower and says, "I went to 3 different hotels before I arrived at the correct one, as there were some errors with the bookings. Rashida Ali was placed in the Premier Inn Hotel on 14th of June. But when they arrived, she says, the workers in reception didn't have our names recorded. I had to prove myself. It was late in the evening and everywhere was closed with nowhere else for us to go. I was sitting in the lobby of the hotel waiting for someone to tell us what to do and where to go. She was eventually given a double room for her and her daughter until the next day, being moved to another hotel where her husband joined them. She says we needed a family room, but they only gave one room with just one double bed for 3 people. Survivors raised issues around the lack of communication about their length of hotel stay. Bilal El-Goueni, who lived in flat 152 of the tower with his wife, Rabia Yahya, who was pregnant at the time, and their 3 children, he was placed in a hotel on 17th of June, but received a knock on the door in the morning after the second night in the hotel. It was the hotel manager saying that I needed to find alternative accommodation. I couldn't believe it. Where were we meant to go? He continues, RBKC eventually offered me a night in a hotel in West Kensington, but I needed to stay in Edgware Road because that location allowed me to visit my family in 2 hospitals. They were split across the Royal Free Hospital in North London and King's College Hospital in South London, and I was going back and forth between the 2 every day. It was hard enough being based in Edgware Road, and had I moved, I would not have been able to travel between the 2 hospitals within visiting hours. I slept in my car that night. We were treated like second-class guests at the hotel. Hoang Han Kwang lived in flat 76 on the 10th floor of the tower with her former partner and their daughter Jenny Fei Kwang. She describes her arrival at the hotel. The staff confirmed that I had a room there for a night. They told me that we would have to check out the next day. I did not know how long the room had been paid for. I felt really worried. I thought, where will I stay if I can't continue to stay here? I think that someone from RBKC or the TMO should have been at the hotel when we arrived to give me information. I would have felt a lot less anxious. It was really stressful. Shanir Majid lived in flat 133 on the 16th floor of the tower with his wife and son. He states, I was really anxious about how long we would be able to stay in the hotel. I did not know who was paying for the hotel, but I knew it was not cheap. There was not anyone from RBKC to say, you have the room for this period of time. Samuel Daniels lived in flat 135 on the 16th floor of the tower with his father, Joseph Daniels, who perished in the fire. He says, RBKC would never tell you how long you were able to stay at a hotel. The manager of the hotel would simply put a note under your room door saying, you're booked for another week. There was not one person to contact for information or assistance. Shaheen Sadafi says, some hotels were giving people notice to leave because the booking was at an end. A note was left under the door or attached to the door. People were told to leave with just a few hours' notice because the hotels needed the rooms. Walkway residents also experienced issues about their length of stay. Brahim El Amin, a Grenfell Walk resident, was given a room and was told by RBKC that he would only be able to stay there for a week. I asked where was I supposed to go after that week. The housing officer told me not to worry. They might rebook my room or send me somewhere else, and someone will be in touch to let me know. This was incredibly distressing for me, and the housing officer did not seem to realise this. At the end of the week at the hotel, no one contacted me to say that the room was rebooked or where I should move to, or even that I had to move out. So I went to my friend's home to stay. 4 or 5 days later, someone from RBKC Housing called and asked me if I was still in Dorset House. I told him that of course I wasn't. Survivors and residents report that their accommodation arrangements were unsuitable. Mariam Yusuf Adam lived in flat 14 with her husband, brother and friend. They were given one room with one double bed for 4 people. She was pregnant at the time, as she says. I was unable to get onto the bed as it was too high off the floor, so I slept either on the sofa or the floor. I requested a mattress, but the hotel did not provide one. One of the many volunteers that attended the hotel provided a duvet for me to sleep on. I was in a lot of pain and my back condition worsened whilst I was at the hotel. Sahar Jamal Vatan lived in flat 10 on the 3rd floor with her mother, Mahmoube, and brother. She says on the afternoon of the first day, we were taken to the Tara Copthorne Hotel in Kensington. We had to wait in reception there for 2 hours. At first, they gave us one room with 2 double beds in it, even though all 3 of us are adults, as they told us they didn't have enough rooms for us to have separate rooms. We spent 3 weeks in that room. I had to share a bed with my mum. My brother was supposed to have slept in the other bed, but he went to reception each night and slept on the settees there. Manuel Miguel Ferreira Alves and his family were offered 1 room with double beds for all 4 of us. It was completely unsuitable, especially as they knew that my children were young adults. They had also only offered us a 2-night stay, so we decided not to sleep there because it would have been too disruptive for our family at what was already a very unsettled time. 2 days later, they went back to the Westway Centre and were offered rooms in the Holiday Inn in Earls Court. His daughter and wife went to check in, but they were told by staff that there were no rooms reserved for us. She tried to explain our situation, but the staff were very rude to her. At this point, it was already 7 p.m, so the council office was closed and we had not been given an out-of-hours contact number, so we went back to stay with our friends. As a result, the Alves family did not end up checking into a hotel until the 21st of June. Melanie Urbano lived with her parents and sister, Jessica Urbano Ramirez, in flat 176 on the 20th floor of the tower. Jessica perished in the fire. She says RBKC allocated us a room at the Holiday Inn. It was 1 room for all of us, my mum, dad and me, so I stayed in that room for a few days, whilst my parents stayed with other family. Then RBKC gave my mum a separate room, but in a different hotel, though we needed to be near each other. Mahmoud Kabu, a resident at Testerton Walk, had to share a single bed with his wife in a single room until given a double room about a month later. A number of survivors raised concerns about the condition of their hotel rooms. Mariam Abdul Qadir Yusuf and her husband were not offered hotel accommodation by RBKC for 3 days. However, when they were, she says, as soon as we saw the accommodation RBKC had arranged for us, we left immediately. It was very dirty and not fit for human habitation. We could not believe that the council expected us to stay there. Amina Muhammad lived in flat 51 on the 8th floor of the tower with her nephew. She says, when I arrived, I found that the hotel was actually more like a hostel. It was completely unsuitable. It was dirty and very cramped. Mustafa Abdu lived in flat 184 on the 21st floor. He was initially placed in the Haveli Hotel on 16th of June, which he describes, I was put in a basement. It was dirty and dingy. I could not stay there, so I went to make a complaint to RBKC at Rugby Portobello. RBKC then arranged for me to move into another hotel. This hotel had no hot water. I couldn't take a shower. I still felt in shock over what had happened to my home and to the people I knew in the tower, and I could not believe the terrible hotels that I had been put in. Some survivors were allocated to rooms on high floors. Rabia Yahya lived in flat 152 of the tower. She says, RBKC offered my family, all 5 of us, a room with 1 bed on the 22nd floor of the Hilton Metropole Hotel on Edgware Road. I refused to go. There was no alternative room offered to us on a lower floor, so we went to my mother-in-law's house to stay for a few days, while we tried to get RBKC to sort out proper accommodation for us, which was frustrating. It felt that we had to fight to get our most basic needs met, even when we were in a fragile, vulnerable condition just out of hospital. William Thompson explained that we had all just come out of a burning tower block, and it should have been obvious that placing survivors on higher floors would be distressing. Nicholas Burton lived in flat 165 on the 19th floor with his wife, Maria del Pili. He describes being given a room on the 14th floor. As soon as I got to my room, I had a panic attack and immediately left again and followed the signs to the fire escape all the way down to the ground floor. Some survivors did not receive food provision at their hotels. Jeanette Grebre-Mayem Shawo lived in flat 153 on the 18th floor of the tower with her 2 sons. Her son, Isaac Paulas, perished in the fire. She was not aware of a food allowance. She says, whilst in the hotels, I did not know about a weekly food allowance. It was only when I moved to the permanent accommodation that I was aware of the weekly allowance. I did not know what I was entitled to, so often I would just eat one meal a day, as no one told me what I was allowed to have. Others were unsure what they were entitled to. David Lewis, who was visiting his ex-wife Mariko Toyoshima Lewis and their 2 children, who lived in flat 9 on the 3rd floor of the tower, he says, there was a lot of confusion regarding whether the council would pay for us to order food at the hotel. We had heard that the council would only be paying for drinks, so we only ordered drinks. Meron Waldel-Lassie Araya, a survivor of the fire, was not aware until a month after the fire that her food would be paid for, and as such, she spent her own money on food. Walkway residents also experienced issues with the provision of food in their hotel. Diego Ortiz, who lived in Grenfell Walk, says, there was a lot of discrimination in this hotel because there was a budget for our food. We had a special menu with 4 different meals that we could choose from, and we could not order from the main menu. The hotel workers were not very nice and were always looking at us like we do not belong in that hotel. I felt like a refugee there. A number of survivors and residents experienced issues with food allowances in hotels. Amina Mohammed says, the survivors got together and insisted on RBKC providing us with substance payments because of all the issues with food provided by the hotel. Eventually, I cannot remember exactly when, the council provided us with £300 a week. It was so disappointing that the council did not consider this issue at all, and that we had to fight for this. Ahmed Al-Assad lived in Grenfell Walk with his parents, brother and sister. He says that he received £500 approximately 3 weeks after the fire. He says, I believed it was not enough, especially because for the first 3 months, we could not eat at the hotel and had no food allowance, so we had to pay for food out of our pocket. Many reported their specific needs were not met at hotels. Some parents felt that their children's needs were not accommodated. Rauda Saeed says the hotel she was placed in did not have a cot or any facilities for those with a baby. Eventually, the manager of the hotel felt sorry for us and helped us with our needs, including giving us a microwave, which we could use for heating food and milk for our baby. Wesley Ryan Ignacio lived in flat 62 on the 9th floor of the tower with his parents, his wife and their daughter. He states, it was difficult to sterilise the bottles in the hotel room. Initially, we had no choice but to wash them out by hand, until we had some money to buy a new steriliser. There was no urgent additional support from RBKC for our daughter. Those with disabilities and mobility issues also raised concerns about their accommodation. Alison Moses says, there was no adaptations or allowances for my mobility issues. I was given a room with a bath, which I struggled to use. I reported my difficulties. I was told I was going to be moved to a hotel room with a walk-in shower, but this did not occur. Monica Loco lived in flat 3 on the 1st floor of the tower. She outlines her mobility issues and says that she needed help getting in and out of bed. Despite being told she would be provided with a bed lever, she had to buy one herself due to the time it was taking. On one occasion, she describes falling off the bed and 2 security guards having to help her get up. Some survivors felt that their religious needs were not met in hotels. During the time of the fire, it was Ramadan and a number of residents were fasting. Alison Moses says, the food offered in the hotel was a nightmare. I am a practicing Muslim. The hotel food was not halal. The hotel did not make any accommodations for this at all. The serving staff made us feel unwelcome. Rauda Saeed says, the mosque delivered food and drink to us at our hotel. This was really important for us as it was Ramadan and we could only eat certain foods at particular times. The hotels did not seem to be able to meet this particular need, this important need. Brahim Al-Amin, who lived in Grenfell Walk, said, Breakfast was included, but it was at a set time. I had to buy my own lunch and dinner as it was Ramadan. The eating arrangements were completely unsuitable for me. For the last 7 days of Ramadan, I went to a mosque in Paddington for iftar and would buy my own food to eat early in the morning before starting my fast. Senate Jones lost their uncle, Abdul Aziz al-Wahabi, and his family. They say, it was Ramadan and the local community were very helpful in being sensitive to the needs of Muslim survivors and family members. There was halal food available for breaking the fast. I didn't feel that RBKC were considering our religious needs. I don't know how we would have managed without the community. Some survivors and residents were unhappy with the location of their hotels, as they were placed further away from the tower. This made it difficult to travel to rest centres, visit family in hospital, and take children to school. Wesley Ryan Ignacio says, all information tended to be based at relief centres. I found it stressful having to return to the area and go to multiple sources for information and support. I had no choice but to walk to and from the hotel to different relief centres. Branislav Lukic initially stayed with a friend, then spent some nights at the Westway Centre before being offered a hotel in Wandsworth. He says, I was really disappointed with the offer of a hotel in Wandsworth. He then spoke to someone at the Rugby Portobello Club who found a room in South Kensington. However, after a few days, he says, a man came to the hotel and said that we had to leave. I did not know where he was from, but I presumed he was from the council. It felt brutal. I remember thinking that we were just being moved further and further away. He then went to the Westway Centre to find help on staying closer. This did not seem to get anywhere, and I was told I would have to move. I felt that I was being ignored. Al-Mishet Demisisi, who lived in flat 94 on the 12th floor of the tower, was discharged from hospital on 16th of June and describes being taken to the offices of Wandsworth Council. He says, I did not know why I was being taken there, as this had not been explained to me by anyone. The woman I spoke to at Wandsworth Council was very sympathetic. She said that there was a local bed and breakfast where I could stay for the weekend. I did not know the area, and I had an acute sense of being completely isolated. I think perhaps I took 2 buses from the council building to get to the bed and breakfast. I had to ask people along the way where the place was, and they were doing their best to direct me there. I eventually made it there after quite a long and difficult journey. Marcio Gomez lived in flat 183 on the 21st floor with his wife and their children. He says that RBKC wanted to place me in a hotel which was a considerable distance from the hospital. This was at a point when my wife and daughters were all in induced comas and in critical condition. Farhad Nader, who lived in flat 205 on the 23rd floor of the tower with his parents, he lost his father, Saber Nader, in the fire. He says, the hotel accommodation was far away from where my mother was in hospital, and I was using cabs to travel to see her 2 to 3 times each day, which was expensive and inconvenient. Walkway residents also experienced issues with the distance of their hotels. Fahad Vakar Malik lived in Barrington Walk with his mother, Syra Malik. He was placed in a hotel in Westminster, but he says, because of my dyspraxia, I was not familiar with my surroundings. I find it difficult to navigate new places. I would rather have been closer to the RBKC borough, as it was familiar to me. Mariama El Hassani lived in Hurstway Walk with her 3 children. She was placed in a hotel in North Acton. She says she was struggling to take her children to school and was too far to access support from the community. She says, I was offered a taxi service, however there were occasions where the taxis never turned up and my children were left stranded. As such, I took my children to and from school, and whilst they were at school, I would have no option but to remain in the area until they were finished with school. When I spoke to the officers at the council, I felt that I was not being listened to, that our struggles were not relevant. I felt that others were provided with support and that my family and I were being left out of the borough and isolated. Some share their experience of feeling isolated in their hotels. Mikel Chiappetto says, nobody came and explained what was going on, and although I had a room, It felt cold, lonely, and empty. It was horrible being in the hotel room. I felt isolated. I was just left, and it became clear that it was up to me to get out and find stuff and see what I could do. Life in the hotel was very difficult and lonely. Turning now to the experience of Walkway residents. On 14th of June, Walkway residents were evacuated from their homes, but unclear where to go. Isabel Renito, a resident of Testerton Walk, says that she and her husband spent most of the night in the communal garden between Barrendon Walk and Testerton Walk watching the fire. We then went to sleep in our car for a couple of hours. We then spent the day wandering around the estate. We didn't really know where to go or what to do. We were displaced. Kelly Dowlett, a resident of Barrendon Walk, says that she stayed with her cousin on the night of the fire, and the next day she tried to get back into her flat. She says, I tried that afternoon to get back into my flat, probably at around 3 or 4 p.m, and then again at 6 p.m. There were people there manning the doors to the walkways, and they wouldn't allow me even to go in and get an overnight bag. Between Thursday the 15th and Saturday the 17th of June, I returned again to the walkways, and there were police officers standing outside, who informed me that I still wasn't able to enter my flat until they could confirm it was safe to do so. The police did not say how long it would be before I could get back into my flat. Eventually, I was allowed back into my flat just over a week after the fire. I was shocked and felt desperately guilty when I saw that there were people actually sleeping on the grass by the walkways close to the tower. Helena Hartley lived in Hurstway Walk with her son. She went to stay with her mother while her son went to stay with their father. They moved back into their flat on the 19th of June. She states, I did try to phone a helpline set up by the council, which I found out about through other residents. However, no one on the helpline seemed to know anything about whether it was safe for us to return to the walkway flats. They referred to a press release that was coming out, but had no immediate update for residents who rang up. I eventually heard that the survivors of the tower were being housed in hotels, temporarily, but I did not think that this emergency housing was available for residents of the walkway flats. Marcia Levi was placed in a hotel, but after a week she went back to the flat to get some clothes. She says there were TMO representatives with clipboards knocking on doors and walking along Testerton Walk. One of them asked us, who told you that you can't come back? We were told by the council at the Westway that we couldn't come back. Elaine Lara, a Barrendon Walk resident, stayed at a hotel until the 16th of December 2017, which is when she says the heating and hot water were turned back on and we returned to Barrendon Walk. Farah Sarouk lived in Hurstway Walk with her husband and 4 children. She says that on the day after the fire, I called the TMO's 0800 number that I would always call if I had a problem. I was told that I could go back to my flat in Hurstway Walk if I wanted to, but it would be at my own risk. They were not able to give me any information about what the risks were or what was the long-term plan for residents of the walkways. We then briefly stayed at my mum's house, I think only for one night, before returning to Hurstway Walk. We couldn't stay with family forever, and I was not told at that stage about any alternatives. We had nowhere else to go. She goes on to say there was no heating and no hot water in any of the walkway flats and made it very difficult to live with small children. The TMO had told us that the heating and hot water would be back up and running at some point, but they didn't say when. Some of my neighbours told me that Virgin Active in Kensington had let them use the shower there. I called them up about this and they agreed we could go there to wash. It was quite embarrassing and difficult showering with my baby. Hadija Arkid from Hurstway Walk says, as we had no hot water and all the gas was switched off, we were told that we could go to the Westway to have a shower, so we did so. She continues, as soon as they established that we were from the walkways, it's like your needs weren't as great as those from Grenfell Tower or Walk. Some walkway residents were let back into their properties and then subsequently asked to leave. David O'Connell, who lived in Barrendon Walk with Viviana Rouleau, says in relation to the 15th of June, we had heard rumours that some Barrendon residents were being let into the flats, so we headed over there. At about 2 p.m, we were let back in. We started to settle down and checked upon our pets. A few hours later, between 4 and 5 p.m, a police officer told us that we had to leave. Some Walkway residents were allocated hotel accommodation at rest centres. Margaret Novell, a Grenfell Walk resident, spoke to someone at the Westway Centre who arranged a hotel for her that evening on the 14th of June. Others were not. Christine Richer lived in Hurstway Walk. On 14th of June, she went to the Rugby Portobello Club and spoke to someone at the desk who she believed to be either from the council or the TMO. She says, "When I told her I lived alone, she said that they were not providing emergency accommodation for anyone who lived alone and told me that I should go and sleep on a friend's sofa." Benazir Lashari lived in Testerton Walk with her 2 children and her parents. She says, "I was told by a representative from RBKC, the council, in the Westway, that they would not arrange for me, my family, to go to stay in a hotel. This was because she said we lived too far away from the tower, although my next-door neighbours were offered a hotel immediately. At the time, it was so chaotic that the council officers who were there to provide emergency assistance did not know who lived where the flats were in relation to the Grenfell Tower. They did not seem to have a plan." Maria Gill lived in Hurstway Walk with her daughter. She was told a hotel would be organised, but it was not. She says, "The person I spoke to took notes and told me they would organise for a hotel and they would give me a call on the same day, but nobody called." Charlotte McMahon lived in Barrington Walk. She says, "I had been calling the homeless housing needs number at RBKC from the morning after the fire. I would be waiting on the line for an hour to speak to someone. When I spoke to someone, I was told they would call me back, and they never did. I had been calling them as I could not go back to my flat. I was told that RBKC would book a hotel for my family and I, but this took countless efforts on my and my friend's part before this was arranged. It took 1 week before my children and I were provided with hotel accommodation." Cesar Renito says, "Another resident gave me a housing line number for the council and told me that people from the walkways were able to get temporary accommodation. I called on the evening of 18th of June. At first, the council did not want to give us anything. I mentioned that Isabel had a chronic health condition and that seemed to change their minds. We were then told that they only had 1 hotel room available and it would only be for 1 night. Other Walkway residents were placed in hotels much later. Layla Rehani, a Barrington Walk resident, received a call from a housing officer, Dion Wilkes, 3 to 4 days after the fire. She asked me if I was safe and where I was staying. I informed her that I couldn't go back home. I had no money and nothing to wear. I also informed her that my son had no uniform to go to school. She advised me to go to the uniform shop and go to Westway to stay there. I told her that I did not want to go and sleep in a gym because I was pregnant and had a 1-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 12-year-old. She advised me to call for temporary accommodation to see if they could help me and gave me a number. After this phone call from the RBKC TMO, I can't remember being contacted by RBKC or the TMO again. As a result, she stayed with family for 10 days and was later placed in a hotel." Ahmed Al-Assad says, "The council never contacted us to tell us about hotels. It was my sister who went to the council trying to place us in a hotel. This was over 3 weeks after the fire. We should have been given a hotel straight away." Elaine Lara lived in Barrington Walk. She and her 2 sons were not placed in a hotel until October 2017. Some did not know that hotel accommodation was an option. Paul Norbert, who lived in Testerton Walk, says, "I was very stressed and upset. I could feel my mental state deteriorating because of the shock of witnessing the fire and the chaos around us. I knew that I needed to be alone to try to gather my thoughts. I knew that I would not have the space to do that in a chaotic emergency shelter. Based on what I had heard from the community, I believed that was the only option being offered by RBKC, so I booked myself a hotel in Bayswater." Some Walkway witnesses report receiving differential treatment to tower residents. Jevon Moses says, "Because RBKC did not clarify whether Grenfell Walk residents would be able to go back to our flats, they kept us in the dark for a long period of time. Because of this, I lost out on housing and was about 6 months behind everyone else. Before the fire, there was a strong sense of community between the residents of Grenfell Tower, Grenfell Walk, and the walkways. We were one. However, after the fire, we quickly realised that because of the inefficiencies of RBKC and TMO, there became a hierarchy and a division between us all. We were all treated differently, and this made me and other residents of Grenfell Walk feel unvalued and not worthy. Jill Bedford, a resident of Testerton Walk, says, "In the aftermath of the fire, I was concerned about how the council decided which of the non-Grenfell households would be allocated emergency accommodation and which would not. It is impossible to draw a physical boundary dividing those to benefit from a set of policies designed to address issues around mental health to have arisen from the fire from those who will not benefit. That is because trauma does not work along strict geographical lines like this and is instead a subjective factor. This should have been part of the eligibility criteria for the provision of services, like those relating to the provision of emergency accommodation for non-tower residents." Thomasina Hessel lived in Barradon Walk with her son and stayed at her neighbour's friend's house for 2 nights. She says, "At around 9 a.m. on the 15th of June, I called the RBKC housing line. I wanted more information and to arrange a hotel room. When I spoke to someone, they told me somebody else would call me back at around midday. They didn't, so I called them up again. They then told me someone would call me at around 3 p.m. They didn't, so I then called them again. Whoever I was speaking to told me not to call anymore as I was taking up the line. I was told I was not a priority. I could not return home. My flat had no heating, and I was terrified of the tower collapsing. I understand that there were lots of people who needed help, but I too was in shock and despair at that point, and I needed somewhere to stay too." Virginia Sang says, "As time went on, the attention seemed to shift just to Grenfell. The walkways were almost forgotten, and we feel like the forgotten residents. We are still living in the same place. In the shadow of the tower, we have had to fight for help of any sort." Mr. Chairman, I'm about to move on to section 2, and I wonder if that might be an appropriate time for an afternoon break, or if you'd like me to continue.
Well, if that's convenient to you, it's probably a good point to have a break. So let's do that, shall we? We'll stop at that point, therefore, and resume at 3:25, if that's convenient.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you. 3:25 then, please. Yes, Mrs. Dunn.
Mr. Chairman, can I repeat the trigger warning, just because we're talking about the experiences in the immediate aftermath? For anybody that may want to leave the room or pause the live stream, please do so now. Turning then, please, to Section 3, dealing with financial assistance. Key issues include delayed financial assistance, difficulties in obtaining financial assistance, inconsistencies in the amounts paid, and some say that they did not receive any financial assistance at all. Some survivors report that they received delayed financial assistance. Aziza Rehani lived in flat 126 on the 15th floor of the tower with her daughter. She says, "I had no access to my own finances as all of my belongings were destroyed in the flat, including bank cards and ID documents. I did not receive any funds from RBKC, including my weekly allowance, for over 4 months. I was therefore grateful for funds I received from charitable funds like the Zakat Foundation." Olu Wasian Talaibi lived in flat 113 on the 14th floor of the tower with his partner and their child. He says, "We did receive money from RBKC a few weeks, probably a month after the fire, but it was too little, too late. If it had not have been for the charities and voluntary groups, we would have been lost. They were 100 times more helpful than the government." Rosita Bonifacio lived in flat 83 on the 11th floor of the tower with her husband. She says, "I do not recall whether RBKC provided any financial assistance to me immediately after the fire. I do not remember receiving any assistance from them. All the support I received was from charities." Rauda Saeed says, "The first payments we received were from charities. I cannot express the importance of receiving cash payments, especially straight after the fire. We had lost all of our cash, bank cards, IDs, without which it was virtually impossible to do anything. We received no cash from RBKC on the first days following the fire. RBKC did provide the hotel room and later transferred cash to our bank account. However, you had to chase your key worker to receive this. I am not sure if they needing to be chased meant that it was only given to the people who asked." Alison Moses describes receiving financial assistance. She says, "I appreciated how much people donated, but having some money made a big difference. It's about dignity, being able to get the item you would choose for yourself. I was more grateful for money as I could buy things that I needed." Walkway residents also experienced delays in receiving financial assistance. Diego Ortiz says that he did not receive any financial support from the council for 6 weeks. Christine Richer received £100 from the Westway Centre when she first visited, and then £5,000 from the town hall at Christmas. Turning now to the process of how survivors and residents had to obtain financial assistance. Corinne Simone Jones lived in flat 145. She says, "In the week after the fire, through word of mouth, I learnt that RBKC were providing money for survivors. I went to the Rugby Portobello Club to ask about this. When we got there, the council wanted us to fill out applications for benefits, but because both Jason and I worked, they told us we were not entitled to anything. I remember thinking, what are they talking about? We have lost everything and can't afford to replace it." Abdul Wahab Abdul Hamid says, "It was very difficult to get financial assistance from the council, as I did not know who was responsible for controlling the distribution of funds. It was an uphill struggle for my brother-in-law and I to obtain funds from the council, and why, as a resident and survivor, I received no help or information. It was extremely distressing, and I later found out that I had not received or even been told about all of the support and assistance that I was entitled to. When I tried to claim for that assistance, RBKC told me that it was too late." Jenny Dainton, when describing her interaction with RBKC at the rugby club, says, "We had to write down on a piece of paper everything that we needed money for. It was ridiculous that we were being treated this way after our home had just been destroyed in the fire. I found it embarrassing and dehumanising to be treated this way. Maria Gill went to the Westway Centre to ask for more money. She says, "The amount I received was not enough. The man I spoke with was incredibly patronising. He told me, 'What did you use the £500 we already gave you for?' And again he asked, 'Why did you have to buy clothes? You have lots of second-hand choices here.' I had to explain to him and he backed down eventually. I felt demeaned and humiliated." There were discrepancies in the amount of money that people received. Rebecca Ross lived in flat 122 on the 15th floor of the tower with her brother Bobby Ross and father Stephen Power. Her father perished in the fire. She says that she received £500 within the first week of the fire from RBKC to be shared with her brother. Mohammed Hariri, who lived in flat 21, says he was given £100 in cash around the 16th of June. Elizabeth Sabiashek says that we were given cash at the Rugby Portobello. This was just to start us off, as we had absolutely nothing at that point. There were representatives of RBKC there who were asking people how much they thought they would need. But of course, this was impossible to answer because we had no idea where we were going or what was in store for us. I can't remember exactly, but I think we were given around £300 at that point. Elsa Afewerki lived in flat 16 of the tower, but was not the named tenant. She says, "When I went to the Westway kiosk to collect money, the woman from the council who was there did not believe me that I was a resident of Grenfell Tower. I think she was going to give me £150, which was less than the £500 that I had been told was available for all residents to help pay for emergency items. She asked me to tell her what I was going to spend the money on and why I needed it. It felt insensitive. I felt that she did not believe that I had lost everything. I was still very distressed as it was only a few days after the fire, and I ended up simply giving the money back." Brahim El Amin, a Walkway resident, went to Westway, where he saw a table for financial assistance. He says, "The man at the stand asked for my address and asked if I wanted £50. I felt that this was ridiculous. I was made to feel like a beggar because I needed more than that. They asked how much I needed, then gave me £100. The whole experience was embarrassing and felt like an insult." Simon Jolly says, "In my view, the system was really badly managed in that anyone who showed their proof of address would be given some cash with no idea of how long it was supposed to last for or what it was intended to cover." Some people say that they did not receive any financial assistance at all. Mariko Toyoshima Lewis, who lived in flat 9, says, "I did not receive any money or vouchers from the Westway Centre, as they had all gone by the time I was able to go, and I did not know about them. Some survivors were refused assistance as they were not a formal tenant of the Grenfell Tower. Nagawa Prosi Nalukwego lived in flat 71 on the 10th floor. She says, "I was very scared to approach organisations and authorities because I was not a formal tenant of Grenfell Tower. I approached the Westway together with Lillian Olwer, who was the official tenant of flat 71, to ask for clothes and because I understood they were providing financial assistance. They refused to give me a grant of funds because I was not a formal tenant." Viviana Rulo lived in Barrendon Walk with her partner David O'Connell. She says, "We could not afford to eat regularly in the hotel and we were not receiving any financial assistance. RBKC staff kept on telling us that we were not entitled to anything as we were leaseholders." Ahmed Al-Sadi, a Hurstway Walk resident, says, "I went back to work on Saturday the 17th of June 2017, not because I felt ready to, but because I could not afford not to. I had to support my family." Some residents did not receive assistance due to issues with the process and being told that the money had already been paid. Farah Sarouk from Hurstway Walk went to the Westway Centre to ask for financial assistance and said that, "I was told that the money allocated under my name had already been given to someone else. They hadn't checked that person's ID. I spoke to other residents that this happened to as well. I just gave up in the end. Mohammed Yahya lived in Barrendon Walk with his wife and 2 children. He also went to Westway for financial assistance and says, I was told that someone else had used my name and had taken the money that was meant for me and my family. This was never resolved. Turning now to Section 4 on psychosocial support, dealing first with the provision of psychological support and secondly the key worker system. A number of witnesses described the significant impact the fire had on their mental health and their experiences of support in the immediate aftermath. Key issues included the lack of information on psychological support available and delayed offers of support being made. Gitiara Pallavani lived in flat 22 of the tower with her 2 sons. She says, I felt broken. Looking back now, it would have been really helpful to have been offered some professional support in those days and weeks following. I do not remember hearing about the possibility that I could get counselling until quite a long time after the fire. Jason Miller says, there was no information in the immediate aftermath of the fire telling you where to go for psychological support at the time. If you did not sort yourself out, then you would be left behind. Nobody offered it directly, you had to go yourself. Leanne Meyer Jackson LeBlanc lived in flat 6. She says, I asked my social worker for counselling right at the beginning. I said I just want to talk about the fire because I could not talk or sleep. I just needed to get it all out of my system. However, I was told by my key worker that you must wait 6 weeks after experiencing a trauma to be able to receive counselling. This was not right. How could that be okay? Florentina Sabiashak lived in flat 43. She describes the delay in being offered counselling. About a year later, I remember receiving a voicemail and a letter which had details of a number to call if you wanted to have counselling. From what I remember, there was no other support at the time or offers of counselling before then. About 2 years after, I received a second letter which referred to a specialist Grenfell Tower counselling service at the local GP centre. The information should have been made available much sooner because in the first few weeks after the fire, when we needed it most, it was not clear how to access these services. By the time these access points were clear, it seemed a bit late. Sahar Jamalvatan says, the support I got was minimal. I was under the mental health team for about 2 weeks. They called into the hotel on a couple of occasions and then I never saw them again. I feel that all along it was a battle for me to get any form of counselling or psychological support to deal with the trauma that I was living with. I did not receive any counselling until 2019. Bobby Ross lived in flat 122. He says, the council should have, but failed, to provide urgent mental health support in the immediate aftermath of the fire. So many people were struggling after the horrific fire and didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know where to get help with my mental health, but I desperately needed it. I didn't know how to deal with my problems on my own. He continues, ultimately, when I was my most vulnerable, there was no emergency mental health support available to me. If there was, I didn't know about it. Some witnesses outline their experiences of the support that was available in rest centres and hotels. Rauda Saeed says, there were staff from the NHS at the Westway Centre, including trained psychologists to provide support. There were also priests and imams to provide support. The NHS staff also visited the hotels to see families in the immediate aftermath of the fire. However, she says, I did not have counselling for 1 year as I was outside of the borough and could not travel as we had been housed so far away from the community and where lots of the services were being provided. Sharon Lackey lived in flat 65 on the 9th floor of the tower with her daughter. She was aware of the counselling available at the Westway Centre but chose not to use it. She says, I knew there was counselling available at the Westway, but I did not engage. I was more focused on the practicalities of trying to rebuild mine and my daughter's life and finding a home. Also, the counselling services never felt very private at the Westway with everyone there. Antonio Roncaleto, who lived in flat 72 on the 10th floor, with his son and former sister-in-law, was placed in the Holiday Inn in Kensington on 16th of June. And he says, most days there were letters put under the door of our hotel room about support and counselling services available from the NHS. Psychologists or counsellors were also available in the hotel lobby at certain times of the day. Jose Vieiro says, as far as I was aware, psychological support was always available if you needed it. A lot of people came to the hotel to see if we needed any support. I did not seek out support of that type, so I cannot comment on the quality, but it seemed available. Walkway residents also experienced issues in relation to psychological support. Halima Diayo Maho was a resident of Grenfell Walk. She says, I was not offered any psychological support, and no one from the council visited or contacted me. I felt that I had to support myself and just try to cope, even though I felt so unwell and overwhelmed. I was at the Hilton Hotel for 6 months before I was able to access any psychological support. Jevon Moses says, I never received any treatment despite signing up for it. I gave my room number and contact details. I was left waiting for a very long time. This made me feel ignored because nothing was happening. I wish I had counselling much sooner. I really would have benefited from it. Some Walkway residents said they experienced issues with counselling due to language barriers. Zahra Al-Assad says, I did not receive any counselling from anybody, not in the hotel or not anywhere else, or not elsewhere. I have not received any psychological support, especially because we do not know the language and we are illiterate. So even if we see something in writing, we would not be able to recognise if it was helpful to us. Amina Kabu lived in Testerton Walk. She says, at some point, I cannot remember when, we were appointed a key worker. She told us that we could request counselling. I was really struggling at the time, so I decided to start counselling. As I do not speak English, they provided an interpreter, but it was very difficult for me to fully benefit from the process when everything had to go through a third person, so I stopped attending after 2 months. Contrastingly, some were more positive about the availability of psychological support. Jessica Gomez says, there was quite a lot of psychological support available. It was all at the Red Cross and Westway. You would get a lot of psychological support if you needed to speak to somebody. I was not ready to do so, but I knew that it was available to me. A number of witnesses who lost loved ones in the fire describe their experiences of the provision of psychological support in the immediate aftermath. A key issue was the absence of support available. Asia Gamhi, who has sadly passed away since giving her witness statement to the inquiry, lost her brother Abdul Aziz Al-Wahabi and his family. She said, I didn't see any psychological support or services being offered in the first days and weeks after the fire. She continues, I didn't have a key worker until around 6 months after the fire. We are quite a large family and I wasn't expecting all of us to be supported, but I was shocked that no one from RBKC had contacted my mom. She had lost her daughter-in-law, son, and 3 grandchildren, and no one checked on her. I googled Grenfell Support and spoke to someone. I was really upset and cried on the phone and told her that my mom wasn't getting any support. Sadiq Jamal Kelbito lost his sister, Noura Jamal, her husband, Hashim Kadir, and their 3 children, Yaqub, Firdaus, and Yahya, who lived in flat 192 of the tower. He says, I received no offers of emotional or psychological support from RBKC. The first offer of support of any kind was when we were attending the hearings and met an Amharic-speaking counsellor working with Hestia, who identified our need for emotional support and arranged for this. This was in mid-2018, about a year after the fire. Some witnesses felt that they received timely support. Zainuddin lost his daughter Zainabdeen and his grandchild Jeremiah, who lives in flat 115 of the tower. He says, I was offered mental health support from the Red Cross in the form of counselling services. This help was provided straight away, and I was initially put in touch with the Red Cross by RBKC, who gave me a contact number for them. Turning now to the topic of key workers. A number of witnesses share their experiences of the key worker system. Key issues include the timeliness of allocation, inconsistent quality in the service provided, and the high turnover of key workers. Survivors were assigned key workers at different times. Corinne Simone Jones was assigned a key worker within the first 24 hours of the fire. She says in the first 24 hours after the fire, there were a number of key workers who called me or texted me saying they were my key worker and asked me what we needed right now. They were all telling me different things. However, others had to wait much longer for a key worker. Mahboube Jamal Vatan, who lived in flat 10 of the tower, says, for the first 3 or 4 months, there was no key worker allocated to me. David Andrew Benjamin, a survivor of the fire, says, I was not assigned a key worker immediately after the fire, as I was not a resident of the tower. This means that I did not receive information about services such as counselling, which would have helped me after the fire. I was not offered any support by RBKC until 2018, when I was allocated the same key worker as Zoe and her family, but this was only after I requested this, as I was struggling. Walkway residents also experienced delays in being assigned key workers. Cesar Renito says, we were told we could have a key worker, but it was difficult for us to get one. It seemed like the council was short of staff. We got a key worker in around September or October 2017. Some Walkway residents were not assigned a key worker at all. Glenn Young, who lived with his wife in Hurstway Walk, says, we did not hear from RBKC following the night of the fire, and we were not allocated a key worker. Although we had heard of others who had key workers, we were not assigned one and did not get any information about key workers. It was as if we had been missed out. Agnes Murray lived in Barradon Walk with her daughter. She says, I was told I would not be given a key worker as they were only for Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk residents. At some point later, I was told that I would be given some kind of support worker. They did not make it clear to me that this policy had changed. I was assigned one. The worker met with me, listened and gave some advice, but I was not sure what powers they had to help. Some bereaved individuals were assigned key workers some time after the fire. Anna Pumar, the former partner of Gary Maunders, who lived in flat 161 of the tower and perished in the fire, says, around a month after the disaster, I was contacted by a key support worker who has again provided us with any support and assistance that we have needed, including being signposted to psychological support, which we have accessed without issue. Farah Janaya, a bereaved relative of Fawzia El-Wahabi and her family, says, I read a message on the Grenfell WhatsApp group that RBKC were providing a key worker to families as a point of contact. We did not have a key worker, and we had not been contacted by RBKC about this. We were allocated a key worker around 16th of August 2017, after our family liaison officer contacted RBKC to ask about this. Experiences of key workers varied, with some witnesses finding them a helpful point of contact, whilst others found them unhelpful. Zoe Dainton says that her family was assigned a key worker within the first week following the fire. She says, at the time, I did not think she was very good, but I have now reflected and think she was overwhelmed. She failed to pass on important information. For example, my family was not told that we were entitled to a £30 per day food allowance while staying at the hotel. She continues, my impression, having spoken to other Grenfell Tower residents, was that people had mixed experiences with their key workers. Some key workers were clearly more engaged than others. It became obvious when speaking to other residents that often different and sometimes contradictory information was provided on what support and assistance was available to us. Mesrob Kasem lived in flat 141 on the 17th floor of the tower with his aunt. He says, the key workers we have had have all been very nice, but they have been unprepared, which meant that the support they were supposed to provide has been non-existent. We always received information before they did, as we were receiving our information from the community. We didn't need a key worker. They may have been more effective if they were fully informed and gave us some information about what to expect, but there has been absolutely no structure, which simply increased stress and uncertainty. Sharon Lackey says, at first, there was little communication from RBKC, but this improved after I was assigned a key worker around 7 days after the fire. The first key worker was brought in from another local authority for the first couple of weeks. I found it helpful to have a single point of contact. The 3 key workers assigned to me were helpful and informative. They regularly kept me updated by telephone and email about what support and services were available. However, I know other people had very different experiences with their key workers. Chirag Patel says, our first key worker was not very good. In fact, he was very unhelpful. Often he would not respond to our queries, and when he did, he usually did not know the answer. For that reason, we eventually stopped asking him for help. We did have one key worker that was very good, but he had to step down after about 2 weeks, as he had been assigned too many people to look after. As a result, we mostly organised anything we needed ourselves, rather than relying on key workers. At one point, everything had to be done through our key worker, which made things more difficult as they were not always responsive. Jaime Haymanot Gashore lived in flat 131 with her husband, Richard Fletcher, and their daughter. She says, even when people were appointed key workers, the key workers were ill-informed and were not able to give the help that they were meant to. It was complete confusion. Aziza Rehani describes her first key worker as unfamiliar with the area, as he was not previously based in RBKC and seemed unable to provide information about my entitlements and where I was supposed to attend. I also found my second key worker extremely unhelpful, and at times she was very argumentative, which I found very upsetting. It would have been helpful if RBKC had provided me with an Arabic key worker from the outset. Walkway residents also experienced issues with the key worker system. Jacqueline Haynes says, initially, key workers lacked the authority or position to make decisions or authorise any real actions. They were basically support workers just to be there. If they wanted to do anything that cost money, they would have needed approval. It was a support placebo and not very helpful. They had volunteer workers, which worried me, as we did not know who they were. There was no safeguarding. After concerns were expressed, the plan was changed and properly trained workers were used instead. However, no one I knew got anything helpful from them at this time. Jevon Moses says, RBKC simply did not communicate with us. I think key workers were get-out clauses for the council. They were the scapegoats, and RBKC put them in front of us so they didn't have to deal with us themselves. A number of witnesses experienced a high turnover of key workers, which caused issues. Omar Al-Hajj Ali says, in relation to his first key worker, she was very helpful and became like a friend to me. I felt she supported me, not just because it was her job, but because she wanted to. She would tell me what I could apply for. However, she stopped working for RBKC for 3 months, and thereafter, he says, I then had a period with no key workers before being allocated a string of different key workers. I would have to explain the situation all over again. I remember one key worker would not contact me, and I would contact her, and she would not answer. Some key workers did not seem to know the answers to my question, and I do not feel they understood the situation. Rashida Ali says, I was overwhelmed from how many people I had to meet and keep telling each person my story again and again. Each new key worker had no idea of my history, and I had to keep repeating it all. Even when they wrote something down, they lost the paperwork and would ask me again for the same information. It was not professional, and they didn't know what they were doing. They had no experience of dealing with us who were facing such trauma. It felt like they were just hiring people, anyone. Michael Sabiatschak, who lived in flat 43, says, we had a large number of key workers in the end. I would phone up and ask to speak to you, the key worker, and they would say that it had changed to someone else, and that would be the first that we had heard of it. I tried not to contact the key workers too often, as they didn't seem to know too much. I lost faith in them being able to help us. Lorraine Beadle, who was a resident in flat 13 of the tower, but was abroad at the time of the fire, says, "I had so many key workers I have lost count. Most of them were very difficult to contact, and the whole system was a nightmare. I had one lovely key worker. She was helpful with everything I asked of her. After her, however, I had a further 8 or 9 key workers. Some of these I've met only once or twice. Some I tried to contact, but had no luck as I called them and they never answered. I never met these ones at all." Farhad Nader says, "RBKC continually changed our key workers, which was very difficult. Each time we were given a new key worker, I had to explain everything again. Sometimes I called to speak to my key worker only to find out that they had left. In total, I have had 4 key workers, and the first and the last one were very good and helpful." Some walkway residents had positive experiences with their initial key workers, who were later changed. Thomasina Hessel says, "I had a fantastic key worker at the start, who had been working with me from before the fire. She went way above and beyond to reassure me. Unfortunately, she left a few months after the fire because she was traumatised as a result of her work. I didn't like her replacement as she gave me blanket advice rather than this being tailored to me and my specific needs. It felt like textbook advice, and so I found her approach not very helpful." Otmain Ben Kaula, a resident of Grenfell Walk, says, "My key worker was very helpful and she offered emotional support. I was very sad to hear that she was not offered a permanent role with RBKC as a key worker. In those circumstances, she was unable to continue working with me." Ibtisam Al-Fawaz says, "I got my first key worker around 10 days after the fire. She was a nice lady. She would help me and tell me what I need. I had a big argument with RBKC because they took her away around 19th of December 2017. Me and my kids cried. We were very attached to her, and it was a very sad day. Later on, we got a different key worker, and I did not like her at all because she did not do her job properly. Since the fire, I have had 5 key workers." Michael Sabiachak says, "I knew this was an unprecedented circumstance for RBKC, and I tried to be patient for that reason. I had tried to build a rapport with people and to ask to speak with the people that had visited the hotel or the person allocated as our key worker, but I don't think I ever spoke to anyone I knew, or even the same person, twice. It just made the whole ordeal even more unbearable." Turning now to Section 5, on information for those looking for those missing. Witnesses share their experiences of searching for loved ones in hospitals and rest centres, calling the Casualty Bureau and being assigned family liaison officers. A key issue is the absence of a clear and centralised system of information about those who are missing. A number of people looking for their families and loved ones searched in rest centres. Marlene Anderson was looking for her father, Raymond Bernard, who lived in flat 201 on the 23rd floor of the tower. She attended the Westway Centre on 19th of June and says, "I walked into the Westway Centre and registered my name with reception. The atmosphere in there was chaotic. There were lots of different desks for all sorts of different things, none of which really helped me. Everything seemed aimed at providing help for survivors. Of course, all of this was incredibly important, but as a family member who had a missing relative, I felt nothing in the centre was relevant or helpful to me. It did not really seem like it was for those who were looking for loved ones. So once again, I was left feeling lost, with no direction of what to do or where to go next." Muhammad Ragab lost his nephew, Hisham Rahman, who lived in flat 204 on the 23rd floor of the tower. He told staff at the entrance of the Westway that he was looking for his nephew, and he was allowed in. He says, "I was really shocked at what I saw inside. It was like a refugee camp. There were people on the floor who had escaped the tower with no place to sleep. I saw RBKC inside. I think I also saw TMO staff. There were lots of people there. It was hectic. It was not organised at all. I was not given any information about Hisham whilst I was there or what to do next. Others were not allowed entry into the Westway Centre when looking for their loved ones. Raja Telat lost her uncle Abdul Aziz Al-Wahabi and his family. She says, when I arrived at the Westway Centre, the volunteers would not allow me entry as they told me I needed a wristband to identify me as a relative of the deceased. I had no idea how to obtain one, which was very frustrating. Noha al-Baghdadi, the bereaved cousin of Hisham Rahman, says, I went to all of the relief centres and shelters set up in the local area that I knew of, including St Clement and St James Church, the Methodist Church, the Al-Manar Mosque, the Westway Centre and the rugby club. I went to each one asking if people had seen Hisham or knew any information about him. The atmosphere in these shelters was horrible. Everything was hectic. There were people everywhere. It was the community who was trying to help and were trying to provide answers about what to do and where to go. Farah Janaya went to various rest centres in search of her missing family, including the rugby club, St Clement's Church, Notting Hill Church, Latimer Church and the Westway Centre. She says, I felt so frustrated that there were a number of rest centres which had opened up for survivors, but when I went in, they were just full of volunteers and donations. I was so confused as to where any of the survivors were. I wanted to speak to them to find out if they knew the family or had seen them. There seemed to be a real lack of organisation or a plan in place for where everyone should go to get help. The different centres were handing out food and water, and I didn't take any donations, as all I was looking for was guidance on where else I should go to find out what happened to my family. Amina Chair Yemlahi lost her brother Abdul Aziz Al-Wahabi and his family. She says, at some point we were asked to leave Rugby Portobello. I think this was a horrible thing to do to us. We were told that Rugby Portobello was only for people who had lost their homes and had nowhere to go. We didn't know what to do. It was unbearable. A number of witnesses describe their efforts in trying to find their family members and loved ones in the absence of any clear and centralised information. Sabah Abdullah lived in flat 143 of the tower with his wife Khadija Khalufi, who perished in the fire. He was placed in a hotel on 14th of June. He says, I was still so worried about my wife. I remember speaking to members of the press in case they could help me find her. I remember going to hospitals to look for my wife. I didn't know how to get support from anyone official or where to go to find out about my wife. I would not wish this situation on my worst enemy. I could not think about anything other than finding my wife. He continues, I found it hard to access information after the fire. At this time, I was out of my mind with sorrow. My wife had gone, and I wanted to join her. I did not know where to go to turn for help. Chanel Spence lost her uncle, Gary Maunders. She says, I carried on looking in the area, desperately trying to find information about my uncle Gary. The days that followed would consist of full hours from day to night for many days, and so it is difficult for me to be precise about timeline. We just went through it non-stop. It was chaos. It was all a blur. Miriam Lamprell lost her daughter, Deborah Lamprell, who lived in flat 161 of the tower. She says, there was no system in place for people like me who were desperate to hear information about their loved ones but who could not make themselves easily visible to the authorities. Had I not had the help of Debbie's colleagues or my relatives, I am concerned I might have been completely forgotten or overlooked. The authorities relied too much on the assumption that people looking for information about their loved ones would know where to go or who to call. She continues, my daughter was taken from me, and nothing will make up for that. But my anguish in that first week would have been much easier to cope with if I had been given clear and regular updates from those who were in charge of the recovery effort. Marlene Anderson says about the 14th of June, I then called around a collection of different hospitals asking about my dad and whether he had been admitted. None of them could tell me anything. I did not know who to call or where to get information, which was incredibly frustrating. It was such an awful feeling. I felt like I was just being batted around, literally going around in circles, with no clear direction or answers on what I could do. She continues, looking back now, it was the lack of information in the first week or so that was really crippling. It was chaotic. I still did not know where to go or who to ask for information. I felt totally lost. Jadwiga Nowak, a bereaved relative of Hisham Rahman, says, there was no information centre or central point where residents and the bereaved could go and leave their details and find out what had been established so far. There should have been a designated place for people to approach to raise their concerns or leave information. Relatives of the El-Wahhabi family experienced issues with the lack of communication. Ahmed Chelat says, I did not receive any information about any services regarding those who were missing or deceased from the council or the Casualty Bureau. Any information released by the police seemed to be on an ad hoc basis, and there did not appear to be a coordinated effort to relay information. I was so frustrated. Abdul Hamid El-Wahhabi says, I was lost. Nobody contacted me. I felt that I had no support and that myself and my family did not matter. Amina Chair Yamlahi says, at some point on 14th of June 2017, before we came home, I remember speaking with a woman who told me she was from the TMO. She took the names of my brother and his family. She said that she would be okay, she would be back in touch, but she was never back in touch. She didn't even ever ask if we were okay. No one from the TMO ever got in touch with us. I am appalled by this. She continues, after the fire, no one from RBKC or the TMO got in touch with me. My husband, my son, or my daughter. We were struggling with everything. We had no key workers and no support from anyone. Nothing at all. It was my son Bilal who found out that we were entitled to support. This was in September 2017. A number of witnesses share their observations on the absence of a list of residents and how this impacted the search for those who were missing. Joseph Kyle John says, there was no way to find people after the fire. There were people everywhere and I could not tell who was who. RBKC did not have a proper list to identify people. There was a lot of confusion in trying to identify people. I think RBKC failed to do their job as they should have, help make a list of people that had survived the fire and those that were missing. RBKC did not even know who was missing after the fire. It was only through the work of the community volunteers that a list of missing people was put together. Nicholas Burton says, I remember that at the Rugby Portobello there was a big piece of cardboard on which someone had made a grid of the tower. As people came through the centre, they could add their own details to their flat or add information about any residents or survivors they had seen alive since the fire. This meant that we were able to piece together our own picture of what had happened to our friends and neighbours, which people could add to if and when they saw someone they knew or recognised. We were not getting information from the authorities about our friends and neighbours, so this provided us with a way of piecing together what had happened to people ourselves. Jenny Dainton says, I do not remember when RBKC finally arrived at the rugby club to organise emergency accommodation for residents. They were placed in a separate room from the main hall. I was shocked that RBKC did not turn up with a list of residents' names from Grenfell Tower. Instead, they were asking residents who we were and what flat we lived in. It was clear that they had no idea. Some witnesses raised concern about how the absence of clear and centralised information led to misinformation. Mikel Chiappetto says, on the night of the fire, I had no idea what had happened to Berkti and Biruk. I was desperate to find them and was anxiously searching for them. I visited the pub on Latimer Road, where some survivors had been taken, went to the leisure centre and started going to hospitals from around 7 a.m. I went to 5 hospitals all over London, visiting them more than once. Each time I was told that Berkti and Biruk was not on the list. At one point I was told someone had seen Biruk in an ambulance and Berkti on the stairs. My heart would leap and I would have hope, but misinformation seemed everywhere and there was just no source of reliable information. In the afternoon, I went to HM Coroner's office in Westminster and was told that they had not heard of Berkti or Biruk. It was desperate. Farah Janaya says, I did not know whether Fawzia and her family were dead or alive. I kept hearing contradictory things from people on the street about the Al-Wahhabis. There was a lot of information about survivors being spread by word of mouth, and it was difficult to know what was true or not. I saw no one near the tower who was an official who could help me. This made it even more overwhelming. Samuel Daniels says, we spent all day looking for my father in case somehow he had got out. We called all the hospitals we were told Grenfell Tower victims had gone to. I was told by my rent officer to go to the Salvation Army in Portobello, where they have a family reunion centre, and that my father was there and marked as safe. I told them that he was not there and that he cannot be safe. I went and my father was not there. Anne Murphy lost her brother, Dennis Murphy, who lived in flat 111 on the 14th floor of the tower. She says, I remember that my 2 daughters came back from the rugby club with information that Dennis was alive. They were told by someone with a badge that Dennis was rescued. Even my brother phoned me on the afternoon of the 14th of June to say that Dennis was alive, as he had just been told at one of the centres that he, Dennis, was in one of the hospitals. We all cheered at this news, but we were just being given completely false information from different sources. A number of witnesses share their experiences of calling the Casualty Bureau. Miriam Lamprell says about the 14th of June, I remember we called that number what felt like hundreds of times that day. I would say that the communication between the authorities and relatives of those missing should have been much better. Had I not contacted the Casualty Bureau myself, I am not sure anyone would have thought to contact me at all. When I called the Casualty Bureau number, I was only ever told to call back another time for more information. Anne Murphy says, as soon as the emergency number did appear, I called immediately and got a recorded message that there was no people to answer calls as they were waiting for call handlers. I eventually did get through to the emergency number. I cannot remember exactly what I said, but their response was that someone would come round or someone would call me. However, we did not hear anything back from this emergency number. It was of no practical use to us at all. Bushra El Gourja, a bereaved relative of the El Wahhabi family, says, I also called the helpline. That too was disappointing. The person on the line asked me the names of my missing family, flat and floor number. That is all the information they requested. It was a one-way conversation, and they did not even take my number. It was not a helpline, but purely a way for the authorities to gather information. It was not devised to help keep loved ones informed, and I think this should be considered in future. The only suggestion they gave me was to call hospitals for information. Sharamin Bernadette Bernard lost her brother, Raymond Moses, who lived in flat 201. She says, on the morning of the fire, I contacted the helpline, which I saw on the TV. I was given a reference of M110 and on the second call M1802 to use when calling back. However, often when I tried to call back, I couldn't get through as the line was constantly engaged. This could be due to the lack of organisation and coordination, or an indication of the large numbers of people seeking to utilise the helpline service. Senate Jones says, on the news there was a telephone helpline to call to report missing people from the fire. I called the number on the day of the fire, 14th of June. The phone operator asked for names of my family members, their dates of birth, flat number and the last contact we had with them, and said that I should call back if I had any updates. They didn't give me any information. They were just taking down the details. They gave me a reference number to quote for the call. I called the number again 3 or 4 times that day, but didn't receive any information. They never called me back. It seemed like their role was solely to take information from me. I remember pleading with them, is there anything you can tell me, please? And they said, we can't, I'm sorry. Some individuals who lost loved ones were based abroad and had concerns about the absence of official information. Rasha Ibrahim was abroad at the time of the fire. She lost her sister, Rania Ibrahim, and her daughters, Fatia and Hania, who lived in flat 203 of the tower. She says, "I was desperate for official information. I really wish that some official had made contact with me directly to update me, even if the content of the update was that there was no confirmation and that they were still missing. This would have helped immensely in terms of understanding what was known and what was not known." Some witnesses share their experiences of how they found out that their loved ones had perished in the fire. Omar Al-Hajj Ali says, "I find it very upsetting to know that photographs had been taken of my brother lying on the ground and put up on the internet. However, what upset me the most was knowing that Muhammad had been left lying on the ground outside Chesterton Walk. I didn't know how long he had been left there, but he must have been left unattended, otherwise someone could not have taken a picture of him. I found this very distressing. I think my brother should have been treated with more dignity and respect." Peter John Murphy lost his father, Dennis Murphy, in the fire. He says, "I was never officially told that my father had died. I heard from the news that they confirmed my dad had died, but I thought they had misspoken about it and would apologise for it later." Jeanette Grebremaim Shawo says, "I had just lost my son and I felt like no one cared. No one, except friends and family, approached us to help. Instead, we were left in the dark and felt alone. We only even found out that Isaac had died on the news. I am very angry and upset about how we were treated by the authorities. No one had information, and we found out that I had lost my son in an extremely insensitive way. I feel like things should have been handled better." Witnesses share their experiences of being assigned family liaison officers. Some share their positive experiences. Marlene Anderson was assigned a family liaison officer around a week after the fire. She says, "I felt like I finally had a source of information and had someone to contact with questions. He did not have any news for me at first, but just having him call me, offering to support me and assure me that he would let me know as soon as any more information was out there was so much more reassuring. Before speaking to my family liaison officer, it was horrible. I felt totally lost and did not know who to ask for information. Anybody I did ask did not really help me." Others share more negative experiences. Omar Al-Hajj Ali says, "A police officer introduced himself to me in the hospital and said he was a family liaison officer. He did not want to tell me a lot of information about Muhammad. I did not feel like talking to the police at that time. He looked serious and difficult to talk to. He looked like a very formal official who would only give me information when he had to." Farah Janaya says, "I was not aware that families were allocated a police family liaison officer dedicated to them. My mum had called the police several times and had told them that we were Fawzia's family, so we were sure that the police knew to contact us with any information that they had about the Al-Wahabi family." She continues to say, "I received an email from 2 detectives from the Metropolitan Police Service. Their email explained that they had been in contact with the family of Abdul Aziz, and they were under the impression that they were the only family of the Al-Wahabis in the UK. I felt really angry about this. I had also done my best in writing down our contact details on the lists that centres had been collating. This now seemed a waste of time and effort. What happened to this information? Did the police and RBKC receive it but disregard it?" Some were not assigned a family liaison officer at all. Hayat El-Sanosi, who lived in Sudan, lost their sister Fatia El-Sanosi, niece Isra Ibrahim, and nephew Abu Fras Ibrahim. They say, "Despite being a bereaved family member, I have not been provided with a police family liaison officer. The fact that I have not been given a family liaison officer has made me feel marginalised and unimportant in the eyes of the police." So I note the time. I'm about to start section 6.
Yeah.
I'm happy to continue.
You've got 3 sections still to go, is that right?
Yes, I do.
And can you give us any indication of how long you think you may need to complete it?
I think it's going to be about 45 minutes at least.
My preference would have been to finish it this evening, but I'm a little concerned that everyone's had quite a long day, and I have the stenographer particularly in mind. So I'm rather reluctant to continue for another 45 minutes. Just give me a moment. Too long, isn't it? Well, if we're going to push it over, what it will do tomorrow's. Have you got tomorrow's? Thanks so much.
Okay.
What do you think, Gary? Sorry? Well, you never know, because the trouble is you can't tell how long it's going to be. Well, we can't do 45 minutes tonight, can we? No. Not fair on stenography. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
can I suggest that I carry on with section 6 and complete that now? With section 7 and section 8, we can complete at some point during the BSR evidence over the next.
They're relatively self-contained, aren't they?
They are.
Yes. All right. Well, let's do that. So section 6 will take you what? 10 minutes, 15 minutes?
About that, yes.
I'm just going to stenographer, can you? Yeah. She's very obliging.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. Let's continue. We'll do section 6, and then we'll decide where we put in sections 7 and 8 in
Thank
due
you.
course. All right?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Turning now to section 6 on public communication. A number of witnesses describe poor communication about what support was available and that there was a need to be proactive in order to receive assistance. Abdul Wahab Abdul Hamid says, there was a complete lack of information from anyone telling us what support was available, and as a result of this confusion, there was an unequal distribution of support, as those who found out information first were able to receive assistance, whilst others, like my family, knew nothing of the services, were left behind. This particularly affected vulnerable people, including myself and my wife, who had mobility issues and was heavily pregnant. This also affected anyone who did not speak English. Jenny Fei Kwang, who lived in flat 76, says, in the week following the fire, I do not remember having any communication with someone from RBKC about what services they were providing and where to go for help. I received no text messages, calls, or emails from RBKC. They and the TMO should have had my contact details from our records. In the aftermath of the fire, I would regularly check RBKC's website to see if they had uploaded any news or information, but I didn't see that they were using this to communicate with survivors and residents. Their website wasn't helpful to me. Jaime Haymanot Gashor says, the only way to try and get the help and services was by me contacting the various bodies, including RBKC, via email and telephone. However, it was a nightmare, and the last thing that I needed on top of all of the other stress, they would not action any of our pleas for help. Jose Viero says, if my English was not as good, if I did not have the support of my friends and family around me, I would not have received the amount or quality of the help and support that I received. In order to receive information about the services and support, you had to be proactive. It was all received through the grapevine and by word of mouth. You did not want to feel left out and miss something. So within the chaos, you had to try. Leanne Meyer Jackson LeBlanc says, I started to use social media to stay locked in and attend meetings. I started to contact people, i.e. groups of people who were survivors, which seemed to be the best way to keep informed. There was so much information flying around. It was chaotic. It seemed that you had to get out there and obtain information yourself. You received little otherwise. Contrastingly, some had more positive experiences in terms of receiving information. Daniel Brendan Griffin, who lived in flat 31 of the tower, says, Generally speaking, information was communicated to me by phone and email. I think I was generally kept informed, and if I needed anything, the key worker helped. Mustafa Abdul did not think there was an absence of information, but that people were not in a position to engage. He says, I think that there was a lot of information out there for residents of the Lancaster West estate, but the issue was that because of what had happened and because it was so traumatic, people were not in the right frame of mind to be able to engage with the information out there. A number of survivors and residents did not speak English as a first language. As a result, they faced challenges in accessing support and services. Mahmoube Jamalvatan says, from my point of view, other survivors of the fire received lots more help than we did, both of the financial kind and other support like clothes and food. I do not know how they received more support than we did. Was it because I did not speak English? She continues, I have had significant difficulty in accessing things because I do not read English well, and the facilities for interpreting information into Farsi have been very poor. I feel disadvantaged by this. I have always had to chase information rather than it being provided to me. I feel that this may mean that I have missed out on donations that were given out by other charities because of my language problems. I feel it has not been fair or equal. Hoang Han Kwang says, the first time that I recall direct contact from them was when I received a letter at the hotel from RBKC, which was about a week after the fire. This was written in English and my daughter had to translate it for me. Even when letters were sent to me in the hotel, they were written in English and I couldn't read them. When there were meetings for residents, I didn't have an interpreter, so I couldn't understand what was being said. I would have felt more supported if RBKC had arranged an interpreter for me for meetings or had letters translated for me. It would have meant I could get information directly and not rely on my family and friends. Maria Jafari says, nobody official took steps to understand our cultural needs. They also did not understand that not all Afghans speak Farsi, so when they brought interpreters who spoke Farsi to communicate with my mother, they couldn't understand her because she spoke Dari. A number of walkway residents also experienced issues with the language barrier. Excuse me. Lubna Belfarsi, who lived in Testerton Walk with her young daughter and newborn baby, says, my first language is Arabic, although I speak a little English. Initially, I found it very difficult to get information and help. I would often rely on my friends or neighbour to either update or interpret for me. Sometimes I was not always comfortable with this, especially if I was discussing private and confidential information about my personal circumstances. The language barrier also meant I found out about support and services much later than everyone else, which was frustrating. It also meant I did not have the same access and support as others because I simply did not know what was available. It often felt that I did not have a voice and I was not being listened to. Zakaria Al-Sawi lived in Barrendon Walk with his wife. Their first language is Arabic. He says, official communications would always be in English. We had to ask constantly for our daughter to translate the letters into Arabic for us. She, along with many other residents, constantly complained to Gold Command and RBKC about the availability of material in different languages, as this affected the residents' access to vital information. Eventually, this began happening, but it took at least 3 months for RBKC to reach this stage. Nadia Al-Bouti says, no arrangements were made by the council or government in the immediate aftermath of the fire to accommodate people with special needs. There were also a lot of people like me who spoke very little or no English and had to rely on the assistance of volunteers who spoke our languages just to communicate our basic needs to the council and other organisations. I'm not sure what I would have done if the volunteers were not there to help, especially as my daughter, in her shock, stopped speaking for days after the fire. Witnesses share their experiences of how information was shared and how support services were were communicated rather to them while staying in hotels. Shanair Majid says, "We were not told about a plan for survivors and were just left in a hotel room." Corinne Simone Jones says, "There was nobody in the hotel that was responsible for looking after us. There was no agreed point of contact at the hotel. We went to the manager as we assumed this would be the point of contact. He did not know what was going on. It felt like we had nothing, that the council provided us with a hotel room and expected us just to get on with it." Michael Sabiaschak says, "Representatives from RBKC were sometimes in the hotel in the beginning, as I remember, but this was a bit hit and miss, and they didn't always have the information that you really needed, so frequently couldn't answer our questions. After a time, we stopped engaging with them because of this, and because of the issues that we had experienced with the hotel room." Winton Temexgen lived in flat 26 of the tower with his partner. He says, "Initially, we did not receive anything, but later we would get a leaflet posted through our hotel door, giving an update weekly. However, as there were only 3 or 4 families in our hotel from the tower, I think we were forgotten, and we did not receive anything for some time." Gitiara Palavani says, "We moved to the Crown Plaza on Cromwell Road. It was quieter there. It was very quiet in terms of the support that was available at the hotel. No one came to the hotel to let us know what was going on, and I found I knew less and less what was going on. I felt like I fell off everyone's radar. I was lonely and found myself a bit out of the loop as a result." Tiago Alves lived in flat 105 with his family. He says, "My dad and I went to the meeting at the Rugby Portobello. We discussed what steps we should take to ensure that survivors were being properly supported, given the failings of provision and communication that we had already experienced. We started talking about how little was being done for people. It was all so muddled up and everyone was so confusing. There were rumours and confusion and uncertainty when what we needed was clarity. There was already a large paper list of former tower residents and bereaved people at the Rugby Portobello. Someone suggested that we should build on this list. This was the beginning of the formation of the Grenfell United WhatsApp group." Antonio Roncoleto says, "There was no leadership or coordination from either RBKC or central government, which led to the bereaved and residents establishing Grenfell United, GU. GU was about supporting one another and ensuring that we all had the same information and were kept up to date. I found the GU newsletters really helpful. It was also about us having a united voice and ensuring that we were listened to." Sharon Lackey says, "Grenfell United gave us a voice and was an important source of information, especially through their newsletters, which kept us updated about what support was available. I felt Grenfell United really worked hard to support us all." Ahmed El-Ghwari lost his mother, Maryam El-Ghwari, and his sister, Esla El-Ghwari, who lived in flat 196 of the tower. He says, "I wanted answers in quiet and for the bereaved to be spoken to. There seemed no clear way for this to happen, and so after discussions with other affected bereaved families, I started a WhatsApp group of bereaved people. The aim was for the bereaved to speak to one another and share information. The group continues to this day and provides a chance for us to share information and experiences." Walkway residents did not receive information about whether they could return to their homes. Agnes Murray says, "I found it hard to access information about services and support. I feel it would have been easier to access information if we had been in a hotel. For people that were back in the walkways, there was not much information. I went to various centres that had opened to try and find out information. I had to go looking for it myself." Helena Hartley says, "After the first 24 hours and within the next weeks, there was still nothing from the council. There was no information on their website. I did expect to find information about whether my building was reopened. It was a question of walking around and seeing if I could get in one door or another." Effie Sergio Pulo, a resident of Hurstway Walk, says, I tried to ring RBKC for an update as to whether it was safe to return home and to establish the situation with evacuation. I got through to someone who was obviously just manning the phone. I was told that they were not able to give me any of this information because the council were due to do a press release. I could not believe that the council seemed more concerned with the press release than actually helping and guiding those that had been impacted. Maria Gill says, the council would not come to tell us about the services and support available. They would not communicate with us at all. They left us on our own to find information. If you did not get there on time, then that was it. They would say they ran out of funds. I felt that it was like a little rat race. So that concludes section 6.
All right, would that be a good point at which to call a halt for the day?
It would, thank you.
And we'll find a suitable moment to complete this exercise where we can.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thank you
well,
very
thank
much.
you very much indeed. All right, well, I think it's time we call the halt for today. We'll break there. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow when we shall hear further evidence from
Mr. Shuker, Mr. Hissam
yes,
Shuker.
those who are directly affected by the fire.
Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you very much.